And welcome. My name is Vardi Travitsky. I am president of the Hastings Center, an independent, nonpartisan bioethics research institute. The Hastings Center is very pleased to partner with the Knight Science Journalism Program to present you this webinar on the growing worldwide trend of distrust in science and medicine. This crisis of lack of trust is of critical importance to the work of science journalists, scientists in general, and bioethicists. Each of us saw firsthand the many ways in which during the COVID pandemic, we exposed this breakdown in trust in science and even in the concept of expertise itself. Misinformation about vaccines, polarized political views of public health guidance, conspiracy theories, all these were not just conceptual issues, they actually tragically cost lives. So last year, the Hastings Center issued a special report on rebuilding trust in healthcare and science. It's available for free. You can find it in the chat as a link and on the Hastings Center's website. And one of the editors of this special report is with us here today, Lauren Taylor. A key finding of the report is that scientists and other experts who communicate with the public must develop more effective ways to communicate. What's needed is communication about how science works. And scientists should feel empowered to better communicate with people who are not scientists, whether that means during interviews with journalists or writing and speaking themselves directly to the public. Another key finding is that retaining public trust requires experts to be trustworthy. Trust requires belief in both the message and the messenger. So it's on scientists, on all of us experts, to consider our own behavior alongside our efforts to measure or influence public perceptions. So, with all this in mind, it is my pleasure to turn to John Evans, the moderator of today's discussion, and to the panelists. Thank you so much for being with us. We're looking forward to hearing more ideas on what we can do to rebuild trust in science and in medicine. John, on to you.
Thank you very much, Vardit. My name is John Evans. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of California at San Diego. And as Reddy just said, if there was a time when science was instinctively trusted, that time is no longer. This is due to a number of societal changes. And the report that was just referenced has a discussion about much of that. But where do we go from here? We have a great panel of folks to talk with us today about this. I'm going to briefly introduce them. First, Lauren Taylor is an assistant professor in the Department of Population Health at NYU and a senior advisor to the Hastings Center. She's the co-editor of that recent report titled Time to Rebuild Essays on Trust in Healthcare and Science. Christopher Reddy is a senior scientist at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. He has communicated his research findings to a wide range of interested parties and recently wrote about these experiences in a book titled Science Communication in Crisis, An Insider's Guide. Nicholas St. Fleur is a general assignment reporter, associate editor, director of events, and host of Stats Health Equity podcast, Color Code. He covers the intersection of race, medicine, and the life sciences. So the way we'll proceed here is I will pose a question to the panel. They will each give a 4-minute response, and then we'll have 15 minutes of discussion amongst us. I will ask one final question, then we'll open up to questions from the audience. There should be a button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A to enter questions that you have. So without further ado, let me ask the first question, and the first person will be Lauren. The question is, from your professional point of view, What are the most significant issues science communicators face when trying to reach the American public? Lauren?
Thanks, John. It's so nice to be with you guys. I'm really looking forward to hearing Nicholas and Christopher's comments. But let me just say a word about trust, because that is one of the key terms in the title, in science we trust, ? And it was also a key word for us in the Hastings Center report on rebuilding trust in healthcare and science. Trust is typically defined as a willingness to be vulnerable at the risk of exploitation. And I just wanted to flag that trust is usually a term that we use between people, or maybe between a person and an organization. But to think about trust in science sort of boggles my mind a little bit, because typically when we're thinking about trust, we're making an assessment about whether or not I think Nicholas, who I'm deciding whether or not to trust, is competent at what he does and has sort of a benevolent intention. And that second part is really key to thinking about whether we should be using the term trust, even to think about the public's relationship to science, because I think there's a reasonable question about whether or not we should be ascribing benevolent intent or any kind of altruism to science writ large. Now, it's a different story when we think about science communicators, journalists, researchers, et cetera. Those are individuals. And there I feel like, yeah, trust is totally a fair word to be using and a fair question to be asking. Should the general public have trust in science journalists or scientific communicators? But I just wanted to flag that it's kind of a nuanced point, but it's also potentially important when you think about the trust crisis generally. I think it's worth noting that trust really works as a term at the individual level, and it kind of breaks down when you're thinking about these more abstract concepts. The biggest challenge, I think, for science communicators as individuals in winning the trust of the public is that we all have a kind of heuristic that we use to make decisions about whether or not to trust that is related to consistency. We look for consistency as a marker of whether or not we can predict what someone's going to do in the future, and consistency has just become a hallmark of trustworthiness. And I think that's a challenge for science communicators because, of course, as Art Kaplan says in his essay in the set that we were referring to earlier, science in some ways is trustworthy because it's fallible, because it changes, because it admits error, because it adjusts to new information. And so I think the challenge is how to both present as trustworthy and show yourself as having some mark of consistency over time, while also staying true to those kind of hallmarks and tenets of science. And the last point I might make is just the way that I think we can do that is slightly nuanced, but again, maybe worth it, is to say, look, we're going to be very consistent in process. The scientific inquiry, the scientific process is consistent, or at least has some very consistent fundamental tenets. The outcomes of the process may change. 1 year we may think coffee is great for blood pressure, and 5 years later we might think differently. But the process remains the same, and that's what we should be kind of hanging our hat on in terms of looking for the fundamental trustworthy components of science and therefore scientific communicators.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. I will move on to Chris Reddy. So Chris, take it away.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me here and joining Lauren and Nicholas. I'm a scientist. I've been kind of a boots on the ground. I've been working on oil spills and other crises, and that gets me to communicating my research and findings to a wide range of groups. And we're interested for whatever reason in how that touches their lives. I'm hopelessly optimistic that we can solve a lot of these problems. And while we've already talked about trust and respect, I think the third kind of key factor is understanding the wants and the needs of the people who want science knowledge. What is their value system, what matters to them, and how do we satiate them? Having that understanding is really quite critical. And also just understanding that, just because you don't have a PhD in a lab doesn't mean you're not smart or you don't have any opportunities to contribute. And so if scientists can think about being teammates and having a better understanding about who they're talking to and why and what it matters to them, that'll have a great move forward for scientists. It's already been spoken twice already today. The challenge is not necessarily whether or not anybody knows how to draw the structure of DNA. the science. It's really understanding how science works. What is the culture of a scientist? Why do scientists do what they do? And why does it matter to them? And if the lay public had a better understanding about our value system, what it takes for us to succeed, what isn't success, and how do we handle when we make a mistake, or what our peers think of us, and what is the retribution? Let me give an example. Nick gets assigned to interview me. He has 6 hours to deliver an outcome. I start working on a research project, and it might take me 6 hours, 6 years. Right? So we have a time difference. Nick asks me a question. A lot of scientists, and this is where the beginnings of misinformation start off, is they're answering the question to make their colleagues think that they're not hacks. So they start off, so Nick gives me the big softball question, tells everybody how talented and smart I am, makes my mom really proud, and he gives me the softball question, and I say, well, we don't know this, and we don't know this, and I'm a little problem, my uncertainty's here, and the model's off like this. And when you introduce an expert, and the expert starts off with, I don't know, you have a lot of a rise from misinformation. And so scientists need to start telling people what they do know and why it matters. And then they can tell folks about where the uncertainty is. So moving forward, a better understanding of culture, what matters to people, and really kind of then really having a better understanding about time and uncertainty. I'm a scientist. I only study things that are uncertain, and I'm okay that I don't get the answer in a long time. We live in a world in which you get an answer in 4 seconds with absolute certainty on Wikipedia, and it's not going to change. And science is willing to be in the long run. It's willing to deal with uncertainty, and willing to understand that science is incremental, it's ever expanding, and it's self-correcting. Science is not a house of cards. It's this beautiful, elegant, ever expanding jigsaw puzzle. And we got to get that transition away from house of cards to this beautiful jigsaw puzzle. And if we can do that and not apologize that science is maybe slow and uncertain, but celebrate it, we can have a lot of great success in how we move forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. And off to Nicholas.
Wonderful. And again, thank you to everyone. I'm very excited to be on this panel and to hear more from Christopher and Lauren. So I would say, in terms of how answering your question as a journalist, I would say right now, one of the big issues that we as science journalists are facing when it comes to just communicating science to the public is, quite honestly, the state of journalism right now. Somewhere about 3,000 jobs were lost in news media in the past year. We're losing more and more going forward, and we're seeing a lot of science journalists losing their jobs, and also outlets that are getting gutted. I mean, I can just name a few off my top of my head here. Just National Geographic, I believe they had laid off a bunch of their staff reporters. Wired Science Desk was gutted. Popular Science is no longer publishing as a physical magazine. I know 538, which did some great data journalism, gutted. Inverse, BuzzFeed, Vice, the LA Times. So all of this is to say that, for those of us who are trying to communicate the science to the public as journalists, it's a really rough time right now. So I would say that's one of the biggest challenges we're facing right now, just the instability in the industry. There was a great quote that a colleague of mine, Michael Grusko, wrote for the Neiman Lab, where he said, we need science journalists now more than ever, but with alarming frequency. Legacy and digital first publications alike are showing that they can't provide these journalists with stability. So who will? So I think part of also answering this question is kind of interrogating the business model that journalism utilizes right now, and seeing, are there better ways to make sure that people who are that kind of bridge between scientists like Christopher and the public, that they can do this sustainably? So that's one big one for me. The other one being that, more and more of part of the problem that we're seeing with people's trust in science and science journalism is really related to political partisanship, which maybe we'll get the opportunity to talk a little bit about. But something that I found was particularly striking when I was looking into some of the statistics and details dealing with this was, Pew Research had a study came out where they said something about half of Republicans now say that science has had a mostly has had a mostly positive effect on society, but about 4 years ago in 2019, that number was at 70%. So that's one of their biggest findings in that particular case and it was higher than, it was more of a disparity than what we saw amongst Democrats. So I think talking a little bit about kind of this political divide that we've seen when it comes to the trust in science, and we all saw really on center stage with COVID, is another big issue that we all are facing. And that leads into just trust of the media as well. And also trying to figure out where are people really getting their information. Going back to this idea of sustainability, excuse me, so many more people are turning to social media sites like TikTok or YouTube Shorts or such, where they're getting information that may not be coming from the most reliable of sources, from journalists who are trained to speak with scientists or are on the ground doing that work, that reporting. And that could lead towards some misinformation. And that can also lead towards, less eyeballs and less traffic for these science stories going to some of these journalistic outlets that are really paying for science journalists like myself and other really well-trained science journalists to be those communicators as well. So to kind of sum that up, I think some of the big issues are sustainability in this field, looking at politicalization of science and the impact that has, distrust of journalists that we're seeing and how that ties into politicalization, and also just where people are kind of getting their information and how we're seeing fewer and fewer of those people turning to trained journalists, turning even to scientists to kind of get their scientific information.
Thank you, Nicholas. And so now we'll turn to a discussion among the panelists. Unfortunately, they're the only ones who get to raise their little hand for now, but we'll turn to your questions and answers later on. So do any of the panelists have questions for each other at this point? We'll start with Lauren.
I was just going to come back to you, Nicholas, on the point about the rise of kind of influencers as a news source, the TikTok and the Instagram Shorts and such. Like, as an organization, or you've been at a bunch of news organizations, is the move there for journalists like yourself to just go to those platforms and develop your own TikTok presence or whatever as Nicholas St. Fleur with all of your credentials and education? Or is the effort more to try and win those eyeballs back to like stat.com on a Google Chrome browser?
That's a great question. I mean, from the business perspective, I think journalism outlets would love if those eyeballs came back to their own homepages or to their material to kind of convert subscribers. But if the goal is really to get that information out, be able to disseminate this scientific knowledge, then yes, us journalists need to be on these platforms or should be on these platforms. I always caveat that nowadays with as well as it works with our own mental health. For those of you who have been longtime users of Twitter, you realize the Twitter of today, very different from the Twitter of about 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when it was really a great place for nice civil exchange of ideas. But I would also flip this question and kind of put it towards scientists themselves who are looking to communicate with larger audiences. Social media is a great tool for that. So in the idea of communicating science, I would highly recommend folks to go to where those audiences are, if that's on TikTok in that case, and you have that expertise, that might be a spot for you, or working with your institution's press office to kind of see what is their scientific, what is their presence on these platforms, and how can you volunteer some of your time to also be, to get some of your science out there. That's what I would say. But yeah, I would say we are definitely getting some pressure to be on these outlets. I know Stat just launched out TikTok not too long ago. Other media outlets have definitely been on the forefront of this. The Washington Post is really great at it. But I would also say, going to my previous point about journalism just not being the most sustainable of career paths, especially as we're seeing right now. You can't put all of your trust in just an institution, working your whole career at a place like the Washington Post, the New York Times. You really do have to build yourself as a credible source. And social media does offer that. And I would dare say that same rationale, that same idea also carries over to scientists themselves. So they're really looking to reach as many people as possible. You know, the scientific publishing process takes a long time. So social media might be the best approach for that as well.
Thank you. Another question from the panelists. I'll ask one. I'll have to use the moderator's prerogative quickly but let me start with a quick question for Christopher. A couple of years ago, there was an article in the academic journal called Science Communication that said that the conflict between the public and science is not really about facts, but about values. And you sort of gestured to that in your introductory remarks. It says that people don't trust scientists because they don't trust their values. And that you read that article, it kind of implies that anytime you talk to a journalist, you should start by saying, my values are X, Y, and Z. So Fauci should have started by saying, what I'm doing here is I'm working for the eradication of human suffering, which sounds ridiculous to scientists, because I think, of course, everyone assumes that that's the case, but it establishes a shared value with sort of regular citizens. What do you think of that as a proposal?
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, if it's the same thing, whether it's Dr. Fauci or another responder, if you ask them what their value system is or what you would say is success, you could say success is when I can go home and see my family and we've solved this problem, or we've done everything we can do to make a bad thing from getting worse. And that's a pretty impressive statement when you ask maybe a politician or somebody else what they call success. It might be something as simple as, I want to get reelected. And I think that's where it's really special with Fauci and other folks, that what they called success was a big picture, want to help everybody in a meaningful and beneficial way. And so I couldn't agree more about trying to define what your value system is. But my point was really understanding the value system of everybody else. But your point makes it even better about first starting out with what I call success.
Okay.
Thanks.
Another question from the panelists?
Yeah, a question for you, Christopher. So what do you hope journalists like myself do more of when we are speaking to experts like you, to make sure that we are getting the facts right and to make sure that we are kind of building that trust with you as a scientist so that we can relay that trust to the audience?
I think, I tell scientists when I train them is to first, have a better understanding about what your job is. And actually starting off with saying, hey, I got this assignment at 11 o'clock. It's due at 6 o'clock. I have 600 words and I have an editor with a very heavy pen. And so these are my challenges. And this is what I need you to do, help me so that we can get the right science in the right place. And I think if you framed it like that, and that really goes back to John's statement, I think you have a lot greater success.
That's great. I mean, a line I use whenever I'm talking to sources and, they might be using some jargon, and I will say to my sources, like if they use a term that the audience won't understand, I'll say, I get what you're talking about. I get what you're trying to convey here, but my editor is just going to scratch that out. There's no way that's making that into my story. So what is a more digestible way to say that? And I'm always very careful with my words in that I don't like to ask people to dumb down the science. Actually, I rarely ever ask someone to dumb down the science. I find the better approach is to ask people to make your science digestible to me. Myself, many of my colleagues, we love to use the analogy of like, if you were talking to the average day, Jane or Joe on the street, how would you explain this to them? Why is this important? And that's what I find generates some of the best quotes that often end up in my stories.
No, and I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that, scientists, when we try to write for some of the best journals, they don't have a lot of worth. So you might just say, listen, I don't have a lot of word count here. So let's figure out how we can get this in a shorter statement. And the last thing I would do when I was communicating with a journalist is not let it be a one-off. Why do these relationships have to be a one-off? It's more about building a two-way street. And so that when you need information down the road and you only have 6 hours, you know how to find the right person at the right time. So everybody wins.
Definitely.
As you guys are talking, it just occurs to me how much it really is about the trust goes all different ways, right? So if I trust you, Nicholas, as a journalist, to not try and make a mountain out of what I think is like a medium-sized finding, right? I'm more likely to speak candidly and clearly, trusting that you will appropriately caveat or include my hesitations or the areas of uncertainty as well. But where I think like, oh, Nicholas has a very different incentive or value system than I do as a scientist, then I'm very careful with my words. I want to caveat everything because I want to make sure that kind of you as a journalist don't run away with a finding that I think needs to be, reined in. And so this is what you find every time you talk about trust in government, trust in churches, trust in business. It's like a fractal. The more I trust you, the more your audience trusts you. It all kind of builds in a virtuous cycle, or it can build in a very virtuous cycle. And unfortunately, it feels like at the moment we're sort of in a degradation cycle. But I, like Christopher, am determined to leave today on a more optimistic note.
Right.
I just wanted to flag the fractal nature of it.
Of course. And to your kind of point about making sure that the journalist who, if you are a scientist, the journalist who you're speaking to does get the facts right. One thing I try to do with my stories, deadline depending on the deadlines, but if I have that time, if I'm working on a longer story, and I'll normally say this to my source, I'll say, hey, because so often scientists will ask to see your piece before it publishes, which for nearly every outlet is a big no-no in that case. But what I tend to do is I will say, hey, before this publishes, I'd love to hop on the phone and we can fact check together. And what I typically tend to do, again, depends very much on how much of a deadline I have here, is I'll just go through my story. I'll take out each and every fact. That could be just as simple as the correct spelling of your name, your title, to the year a paper was published, those kind of things, no matter how small. I put it in a separate document and I basically call up the source and I say, hey, I just want to go through these facts. Give me a yes or no on these. And I find that helps build your trust with your source, but it also helps you prevent you from getting any corrections or getting any of the science wrong. Because, in terms of building this trust with the public, facts and accuracy is super important. And I love to tell my sources just accuracy is the most important thing to me. So sometimes I'll read back to them while we're having a conversation, say, so you said this, is that really is that what you meant? I just want to double check to make sure I'm getting that right. And double checking with sources is one of the best ways to ensure that you're getting your facts right. I don't know if there are too many journalists who are listening in on this, perhaps there are. To Christopher's point about making a relationship with your sources, so much of what I tell early career journalists I speak to is that when you interview a source, if you have some time in the story, that doesn't have to be your only interview with them. You can call them back after and just be like, hey, I'm just calling to double check something. You can ask them, what's your cell phone so I can text you to kind of get this information? Or you can set apart, what I try to do is set apart like a specific time that we can jump on that phone and do the fact check before the story comes up. So often, as I say to early career journalists, is that you send a story to your editor is going through it depending on the deadline. They'll have questions for you, be like, oh, what's this, what's that, what's this? And instead of spending like a few hours searching through the internet trying to find the answers for your editor, call your source back up and say, hey, my editor has a question on this. What is the correct answer? What is the how do I accurately explain this? And your source normally has the answer like that. So to both Chris's point and Lauren's point, us as we journalists should build that relationship with our sources and constantly be in contact with them, and never be afraid to call them back when we're working on a story.
Christopher, I had one other question for you, which is just how you think about the challenge of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, it feels like we're up against a gap in civic education. Like, where are we doing the bedrock? Like, this is sort of the scientific process, or this is how science works. Or you were describing like wanting to do some education around these are the incentives or the culture of a scientific lab. I mean, is that stuff that you find you can do, or like good scientific communicators can do on the fly? Meaning, I've got this finding about oceanography and I can kind of slip that in, or do we need dedicated resources to be doing that, like in K through 12 education that we're not doing right now?
I think it would be hard to get into K through 12, but I think on a more grander scale, having journalists and elected officials have a little bit better understanding about how science works would certainly generate that. And also maybe, in these interviews with the reporters and, trying to give some sense of the culture of it and why they said that and why does that matter? I think it drives scientists crazy when 99% of a populace has a finding agreement on a finding and the story comes out balanced as 99-1. And I think that's really one of the hard parts. And in some respects, that plays out like a house of cards rather than science as a jigsaw puzzle. And so I don't think we can get into K through 12, but I do think we can get into professional societies and different groups.
Okay. Let me do a quick one with Lauren before we end this session. So there are people who don't trust science for good reason. There are people who don't trust science because they don't trust the values of scientists. There's people who don't understand the nature of science. I think in recent years, we've encountered people who they know in their hearts that they can trust what the scientists saying, but for sort of self-interested political reasons, they're going to promote distrust in science. In your earlier project, do you have any insights for us as to what to do about that? And we'll give you the Nobel Prize when you win.
Yeah, exactly. Solve political polarization in America. I don't know that I have specific things to say about what to do about people who intentionally manipulate kind of the public discourse for the purposes of sowing mis or distrust. I hosted a conversation back in May that was fascinating on this point with two diametrically opposing opinions. One was you have to engage these people head on. You have to go straight at it and say, look, this person is saying this patently untrue thing, and let me tell you all about why it's not true, and kind of, like I said, do direct head-on-head engagement. And the other person's view was, nope, you have to just ignore it and let it die in darkness. It will fizzle out eventually. And I have to say, John, I was really left at the end of the conversation not knowing how I felt about it. The context of the conversation was specifically going back to Nicholas's point about Twitter. And so in some ways, it was kind of about Twitter trolls. But I think that the question still stands, and I feel flummoxed about what to do, even in a non-Twitter space. There's a big part of me that thinks the genie is out of the bag, kind of certain kinds of conspiracy beliefs, anti-vaccination concerns, COVID-19 mythologies have become so prominent that the idea that we can put our head in the sand and ignore them feels misguided. And yet maybe there's just a part of me that wishes it were the case, that we could say like, no, just don't engage. You give it more airtime when you kind of address it head on. So we should just stay in our lane, be trustworthy, do work that is, deserving of the public's trust, and that stuff will eventually burn itself out. But I don't know, maybe I can throw this on Nicholas and Christopher, who may have stronger views, because I really have gone back and forth on this myself.
What I would ask is, as a scientist, to try to get an understanding about why there might be a disconnect or a misagreement. And maybe when we communicate to scientists in the future, how we can incorporate maybe this, this uncertainty these folks have. So going to school about why there is an opposition and maybe how we answer in the future may be helpful down the road. And so having an awareness, these people aren't necessarily dumb. I don't think that's true at all. Where are they getting the information, and how can we insert clarity and in a meaningful way?
We'll finish up with Nicholas, if you have anything to add to this.
Yeah, Lauren, I guess it's interesting because I and my colleagues definitely find ourselves in positions where you want to fact check things that are happening in real time, especially on Twitter and such. And you want to provide all the sources. You want to say to people who are spreading kind of like misinformation, like, no, you're wrong. Here's why A, B, C, D, E. And then you also want to preserve yourself and wonder, can you really battle every single troll out there on Twitter, who many of them are bad faith actors, is a lot of what we're seeing, especially on aspects of social media. So I don't know, it really is a balance between, do you have the time to debunk everything? Do you have the willpower to debunk everything? I wish there was a a way where anytime we discuss these things on whether it be not so much online, but like I mean, if you have like a debate amongst like politicians and such, and you have those fact checks happening live, I wish we had more of those in nearly any conversation. Really, like how do you do more live fact checking? Yeah.
Okay, so we are the time is up on this section of the presentation. We'll move on to the final question that I will be asking each person. I'm starting again with Lauren. And the question is, what is to be done? How can institutions work to better prepare science communicators to overcome these issues? And what can be done to repair public trust in science?
Well, maybe I'll just return by way of framing to the fractal comment and say that I really do think that rebuilt trust anywhere is good for trust everywhere. Meaning, whether you are a journalist or you are a scientist or you're on this call from some other professional position, or you're on this call as just like a citizen who goes to the grocery store and lives in a community, the work of knitting back trusting relations in the United States it has to be all of our work. We cannot look strictly to scientists or elected officials to kind of do this work for us. We all contributed to the breakdown. We all have a responsibility to be part of building trust back up. And that can happen in really micro interactions in your community, with your employer, et cetera, et cetera. I think the things that we can do as science communicators, one is, I think, consistent acknowledgement that things almost certainly will change. And that is something that I really look back at the COVID-19 pandemic and think there had been better signposting of early on. It was a new virus. We knew that we were going to learn and learn quickly. And I think we were too committed to providing assurance or the veneer of like confidence. And if I could do it all over again, I think that would be something that I would certainly change. Not being able to change it in retrospect, it's something I'm going to carry forward, right? That we're clear on how and why science may change, even though the process is consistent and reliable and deserving of the public's trust. And then the second thing is, especially coming out of Christopher's comments today about kind of scientist values, I think just personally, I'm going to go to my own professional website and I think update the way I talk about myself to be more candid about where I come from, what my values are. And I don't love this word, but like in some ways what my biases are, right? And let people then apply the discount rate that they're going to apply. And I can't control what discount rate they're going to apply, but I can control what I say about myself, making sure that it is forthright, transparent. And, for some people, that's probably going to earn me credibility. For others, it may diminish my credibility, but I can't control that. And I think that's one very candid to do for me coming out of this.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. I'll turn to Christopher.
Yeah, no, again, working, coming from this as a scientist, first thing I would say is to tell scientists that to do it for themselves, to communicate science and excel in public engagement for themselves and to start local. There's perception in science and research of that you have to check the box on your broader impacts, and you have to figure out a way to satisfy people to say that you're doing it. And in some institutions, they do that for promotions. There's no really good metric or monetary system for that. And so to me, public engagement is a way to make me be a better scientist and a better person. And in a world where, in a science world, where only 20% of our grants get funded and 25% of our papers get accepted, feels pretty good when you can tell a neighbor, your aunt or your uncle, or maybe a stranger, something about science that helps them. And maybe you get that aha moment. And, as a scientist, I struggle with imposter syndrome, right? And that's a really nice elixir to imposter syndrome, is recognizing that you can make a difference for people. Now, moving forward, if I was going to train scientists, the first thing I would do is to give them a lesson in anthropology and kind of the cultures and the value systems. Then I would teach them about avoiding the metric system and no jargon and elevator speeches. There's a place for that. But first, you got to understand why you're doing it and what would be success. I'd also train scientists to understand the risk versus the reward of what they're doing and why they're doing it. And then last, I would start local. Local is really powerful for scientists because the risk is usually lower. The opportunities are much higher. And the opportunities also to keep working and trying to refine your message is going to work better and better. So constantly practicing. Local also works because I'm absolutely convinced that the more the local scientist is, and that's more than just geographic, it could be any type of cultural connection. The more you have an expert who has a closer or local connection with somebody who wants to know, they're going to have a beneficial outcome. So working local, training local, and using local scientists to communicate science is where the victory is. Former Commandant for the United States Coast Guard, Thad Allen, had this statement during the Deepwater Horizon. He said, you don't exchange business cards at a crisis. So my advice to scientists is, and other folks, is to go out and meet other groups locally and understand their value system and what matters to them. It's cheap, it's accessible, and there's lots of victories on the way. Starting local and doing it for yourself and not for the NSF or for promotion. That's all.
Thank you, Christopher. And finally, Nicholas.
Yes, Chris, thank you so much for what you just shared, because it resonates so strongly with kind of how I feel about this subject, which is that whole local aspect. Over at STAT, we've written stories, and I've interviewed a gentleman named Dr. Robert Wynn, who's over at the VCU Massey Cancer Center. And he does a lot of work where he goes door to door, talking to people in a predominantly Black area about cancer clinical trials and why it might be something that they might be interested in. And many folks in these communities, especially in that area, which has like a history of medical mistrust. It's something that we covered in an episode of my podcast, Color Code, where people there just didn't trust the local medical institutions for very good reasons, historical reasons, medical exploitation, to present day reasons about, when you go in to get a doctor check and your doctor is not believing you, you feel like you're not, not being believed, or you're being gaslit. So what he's doing is very much to that same point of, outside of times of crisis, just going in, meeting the people around you in your community, saying, hi, I'm a scientist, I'm a medical scientist. This is the kind of work we do over here. Let me tell you about clinical trials, what they are. What you said also reminds me of the work of Dr. Uche Blackstock, who in her book, Legacy, this is also a source of mine who I've interviewed, who during the COVID pandemic, she did a lot of things where she would appear on television and she would be talking a bit about the virus and how to stay safe and such. And she notes in her book, and she's noted in interviews as well, she'll be walking down the streets and people be like, hey doc, like I saw you on TV, like tell me more about the vaccine, tell me more about this. And she would do things in her communities to kind of tell people about the importance of this, of getting the vaccine, or the importance of staying safe during COVID. So that local aspect is so important. And then what you just said about, business cards aren't shared during a crisis. I agree in the sense that scientists should take every opportunity that they can for public outreach to their local community. Perfect example. Month from now, we have something called a Great American Eclipse happening. I'm a big space fanatic. You guys maybe have seen things on the shelves already, but there's going to be a total solar eclipse going across the country. If you're not already aware of this, you should get aware of this. What a great opportunity for public outreach of science. Look how many cities it hits across. Some of you guys may remember in 2017 when this happened, there was so much excitement. Scientists need to capitalize on these moments where you get to explain to people what science is, how we know that this total solar eclipse is going to happen, how we know the next solar eclipses will happen for the next hundreds of years, and explain the scientific process to them. And then they get to behold this beautiful celestial Super Bowl, if you will, this moment that is just so, it really those of you who have not seen a total solar eclipse, use this as the moment to book your trip to be somewhere on the line of totality come April 8th. But all of this is to say, when we have those things, whether it be a transit of Venus or whether it just be opportunities to understand more about, climate change or any of those cases, we just need more scientists to go out into their local communities and talk about it. Have a Q&A with your local scientists. Do it at local libraries as well, so that the public has a better understanding of who scientists are from like that humanistic standpoint, right? We need to humanize scientists. Scientists are people. And I think one of the great things about also just journalism is that we have that ability to talk about what really motivated someone to get into this work. What was their story and why they're doing this and why it's so important for them. So all of this, to answer your question, John, is going back to what Chris also said, that local level. Use these opportunities to talk about whether it be the eclipse or whether it be some other phenomenon that reaches so many people. Use those opportunities as an introduction to talk about science. You don't even have to be an astronomer or an astrophysicist to take this opportunity. Talk about whatever your science is and say, hey, here's the scientific process. Here's how we know these things. And if you want to learn more, this is why you should, also have this interest in science, and you should also be questioning these things. I really think that in a month, we have one of the greatest opportunities to do that scientific outreach across this country. So if you're a scientist listening to that, take this opportunity as well.
Okay, so we'll move into the final section of this webinar in the audience questions, and I've got one here for Nicholas. It says, I think storytelling can be an effective tool. If scientists and science journalists tell their own personal stories, it can humanize the messengers and make the message more palatable. Do you agree scientists sharing their personal journeys can serve as a point of connection to build trust, human connection, common experiences?
100,000%. And scientists have, like I was saying, they're humans. I was just speaking with a guy named Dr. Eric Jarvis yesterday, and he is a neuroscientist who does work looking at the brains of birds and looking at how we learn about their vocal learning, vocal language. And our interview was a bit about how you can apply that information to understanding speech therapy in humans. But he has such an interesting backstory. I mean, he's been a professional, he's been a dancer for most of his life. And there was a point where he had the opportunity to choose between being a professional dancer in ballet or going on to being a scientist and going the route that he went. And he talked to me a little bit about that aspect and hearing that kind of human side that, not every scientist knows exactly that they're going to be a neuroscientist or that they're going to be an astronomer or something. They have their lives, they go through their own struggles, they go through their own choices and their own decisions. And he was speaking to me a lot about how, he still uses, he has such a strong love for art and how he tries to apply art in all of its capacities to the science he's doing now. Right now, obviously, the most obvious example is just through the listening of singing songbirds as well, finding the art in that. And so much of that comes from him growing up in a family where art and dancing and such was so highly prized. So or was encouraged in that sense. So I would say, finding the human side of scientists is one of the easiest and most effective ways to connect science to the general public.
Okay. Yeah, the scientists have a problem, which is media studies show that the most famous scientist of all time is Dr. Frankenstein.
Really?
Doesn't help.
Can I just riff off on that?
Yeah.
And just, if you do that, you defy stereotypes. Unfortunately, we have a perspective someplace that scientists are the last pick in gym class. And the more you humanize them, the more you find out that they're interesting and they're different and they're not some foolish TV show character. And in reality, they're real and they want to do the right thing for society.
Okay, so the next question, this is for either Chris or Lauren. The boundaries between universities and biotech firms have blurred over time, resulting in an unprecedented rise in individual and institutional conflicts of interest. What happens to scientists' credibility when they may have a financial stake in the outcome of their research? Can we blame the public for losing trust when it seems that science is for sale and scientific experts are somebody's expert? One of you want to handle that?
Christopher, you want to go first?
No, you go first. And you can take 10 minutes too.
Yeah. Well, I would just in some ways validate the question that when you look at the literature on mistrust in healthcare and medicine, there are a couple roots of it. One is racial discrimination. A second big one is financial conflicts of interest. And a third is kind of adverse events or prior experiences of medical mishaps. And all have some kernel of like legitimacy. You know, these are real risks to the trustworthiness of healthcare, I think. The question of what to do about it, I mean, it brings us to the main way that healthcare has been trying to manage its or its scientist relationship to pharma and biotech has been on through disclosure, right? Transparency. Healthcare institutions, health systems, universities don't want to be in the business of saying like categorically scientists cannot do this because they're free people to pursue interests. And so the mode has been, you know, look, within some boundaries, you can pursue opportunities for you to patent things or make money through pharma and biotech, but you need to disclose it to the university, sometimes to patients. And I think a real challenge is like, that doesn't work particularly well. There's been a lot of empirical study on whether or not disclosure of financial conflicts of interest builds trust, whether or not patients in particular understand what the disclosure means, how to judge it against like, well, how conflicted is the next doctor down the line? And so I think healthcare is grappling with, if not disclosure, then what is the other organizational process by which to manage conflicts of interest? You know, perhaps we all would wish for a day where universities say like, thou shall not, and you just cannot have these kinds of relationships. But I think the concern is you would lose a lot of really good labor that would just resign from university posts and go work full time for pharma or biotech. So I think the questioner has honestly brought up a legitimate question and a real challenge for universities and healthcare institutions, to which I do not have a ready answer. But I think it's a fair critique and a fair thing to level against the trustworthiness of these places. It's not that they are wholly untrustworthy, but they are struggling with how to maintain their trustworthiness in the face of legitimate potential conflicts.
I would only ask that to recognize that a lot of these partnerships have led to significant, meaningful change in society, right? And so let's not dwell on the conflict, but recognize that we have scientists who are willing to work, and it's okay for them to make money, by the way, and get their stuff not lost in the library and changing lives. So yeah, we have a conflict problem, but we should celebrate the opportunity that we're getting our science off the research papers and in CVS. And that's a victory.
Thanks, Christopher.
So we have another question to any of the panelists. To what extent do our panelists think that naming and calling out those forces that malign science in the public eye is a worthy endeavor in the work of rebuilding trust in science more generally? Sort of expansion of what you were saying before, Lauren.
Yeah.
I'll just quickly chime in and say, from a journalist's perspective, journalists are also often watchdogs. So if journalists have the facts that show that there are these conflicts of interest in particular that are biasing results or biasing how certain actors are portraying their science, then I think 100% journalists need to first uncover that and share it as well. So I think that's definitely a role of being a science journalist and a role of just being a journalist as well.
Someone else want to add anything to that?
Let's do one more. I feel like we kind of covered that one.
Okay. Claire, do you have another question for me here? Since you're moderating these. Okay. So the question is, would we be better off if more STEM grads went into public service and politics?
I don't know. My mind goes to more than what, like if we were on a humanities conversation and people said, would it be better if the world had more people in humanities and leadership position? I'd probably be like, yeah. And then you ask, well, would it be better if there were more people with STEM and leadership positions? Yeah. Sound great. But I do think the spirit of the question is like, would it be helpful to have more people speaking really cogently and thoughtfully about the scientific process in public? Unequivocally, my answer to that is yes.
Yes. And how do we make all of these opportunities financially sustainable for folks? I mean, part of the reason why we see such a drain of people from academia, fleeing the pipeline is because it, quite frankly, doesn't pay that well. And for so many folks, it's a lot of hard work, a lot of schooling, and in many cases, you're not making enough to really be able to support yourself. That's why so many people do leave these opportunities for industry, for pharma and such. So getting some of those great minds into politics and such, yes, it would certainly be great, but you also want to make sure that they are in positions where they can support themselves as well. Because it would, you can be super, super smart and you can provide all this insight, but if you're struggling to really cover some of your basic needs, how much time do you really have to devote towards the greater societal good? I say as a journalist.
So this may be our final question, depending on the timing. Interesting question here. Commercial communications have been very successful in building trust in brands and products. What can science communicators learn from that experience?
I actually have a view on this because people often ask me, as someone who graduated from a business school, why business appears to be the most trusted entity in society at the moment. And my answer is always because it's legible. People think they know what business does. Business makes money. And whether or not they're making money runs a risk of exploiting you is kind of secondary. If you think you know what business does, then you can judge for yourself whether or not you want to engage and how you want to judge their sort of trustworthiness. And I think this goes back to the core of one of Christopher's comments earlier. We need to be much clearer about like, what does science do? What is it after? What is it not after? Like, what is the internal logic driving scientific communities? And if we can be clearer about that and succinct, I think that increases the legibility of the scientific enterprise to the public and increases the likelihood that it will be seen as trustworthy.
Other comments?
Yeah, I would look to, I'm not, when I look at success in communicating science, I look at the ad council and what they have done about smoking cigarettes, vaccines, even going back to their origination of, World War II and trying not to, give away secrets. Look at these folks who have a cohesive plan of attack about how they can do it is really powerful. So there have been successes outside of commercialism, and I'd look to what the ad council has done.
So with that, we are out of time. I want to end this on time, but I mostly want to thank our three wonderful panelists for the discussion and hope that everyone listening can continue to think about what to do about this, because ultimately it's not up to us, it's up to all of you. Thank you again to everyone who's on the panel.
Thank you. And
Okay,
see
bye.
the eclipse if you can.
Thank you.
Thank you.